I was seeing this dying man in the intensive care unit for the first time in my life. His face was covered in blood. He was unconscious. But just as he was about to take his last breath, he opened his eyes, grabbed my wrist with his ice-cold hand, and whispered a single word to me, "Daughter." I couldn't even move from the shock. But that wasn't the real nightmare. Exactly 5 minutes after that word, the hospital corridors echoed with police sirens. At that moment, I didn't yet know that my husband, my 10-year-old son, and my entire past were actually built on a terrible lie. When you see the photo the police handed me, your blood will run cold. They say justice eventually finds its way, but sometimes justice can burn your whole life to ashes. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. If you are ready, we are starting the longest and darkest night of my life. You might think winter nights in Denver are quiet, but the hospital emergency room never sleeps. My name is Jessica Miller. I am 35 years old. From the outside, I had an enviable, warm home, a reliable husband named Mark, and my world, my sweet son, Evan, who is just 10 years old and in the 4th grade. Evan was my everything. I could burn the world down to protect his innocent smile. I grew up an orphan. I was adopted by a wonderful family, but my biological roots, my genes, they were always like a dark well to me. But until that night, I was unaware that this darkness was waiting in ambush to swallow me and my little son. I was startled by the announcement from the radio. Severe trauma, male, 55 years old, unidentified, critical condition. When they wheeled the stretcher in, the man's face was unrecognizable. Was it a traffic accident or a fight? It wasn't clear. The only thing found on him was an old leather wallet with slightly scorched edges. Inside, a faint name could be read on the license, Thomas Reed. When I read the name aloud, I felt a strange, cold shiver inside me. It was as if I hadn't heard this name before, but felt it. The doctors had done the initial intervention and left. Only he, I, and the rhythmic beeping machines remained in the room. I stood by the man and started cleaning the blood from his face. His eyelids were fluttering. His pulse was very weak. Normally, I shouldn't bond with patients, but there was a strange magnetism in this man that pulled me in. I had just turned my back to leave when I heard a wheezing breath. I turned around. His eyes were open. They were such a familiar, such a deep green that I felt like I was looking into a mirror. He tried to breathe with that wheezing sound coming from his lungs. His hand slipped from the bed rail into the void. Reflexively, I held his hand. It was ice cold. He locked his eyes on mine. It was like he was scanning my soul. His lips moved, and a muffled but clear voice came out from under the mask. "Daughter." I froze. "I don't understand, sir. Please stay calm," was all I could say. But he persistently squeezed my fingers. A tear rolled from his eyes onto the pillow. He wanted to say one more thing. His lips formed the shape of Evan. Did he say my son's name? Or was I imagining it? This was impossible. The machines started to alarm. "Code Blue!" I shouted down the hallway. The team rushed in. Defibrillators were prepared. They were trying to bring him back. But I was cowering in the corner, looking at my trembling hands. Why did this stranger call me daughter? And even more terrifying, how did he know my 10-year-old son's name? Just then, I heard the hospital's automatic doors open. But this time, it wasn't an ambulance coming. The radio sounds filled the corridor. Uniformed police officers and detectives in plain clothes were running towards the intensive care unit as if they were looking for a terrorist. The detective in charge slammed his badge on the counter. "Where is Thomas Reed? Who is the nurse who made contact with him?" Everyone in the corridor turned to me. My heart was beating in my throat. There were only 5 minutes between the man calling me daughter, seconds before he died, and the FBI showing up at the door. And in that moment, I understood. This was not an ordinary shift. The detective's name was Samuel Cortez, and he had the kind of eyes that could see through every lie you'd ever told yourself in the mirror at 3 in the morning, when you couldn't sleep because of guilt you didn't even know you carried. He was around 50 years old with graying hair at the temples and a scar running down his left cheek that looked like it had a story he'd never tell at dinner parties. And when he looked at me standing there in my scrubs with Thomas Reed's blood still on my hands, I saw something in his expression that made my stomach drop like I was falling from a very high place with no ground in sight. He didn't ask me to sit down or offer me water or do any of the things cops do on television when they're about to deliver news that will change your life forever. Instead, he just pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times over the years until the edges were soft and worn, and he said in a voice that was neither kind nor cruel but simply factual, "Jessica Miller, we need to talk about Thomas Reed and why a wanted fugitive's last words were directed at you." I tried to speak, but my throat had closed up like someone had their hands wrapped around it, so I just nodded and followed him to a small consultation room where families usually receive bad news about their loved ones. And now I was the one sitting in the chair where so many people had cried and screamed and fallen apart, except I didn't know yet what I was supposed to be falling apart about. Detective Cortez sat across from me and opened the folder, spreading out photographs and documents across the table like he was dealing cards in a game I didn't know I was playing, and the first thing he showed me was a mugshot of Thomas Reed from 23 years ago when he was younger and healthier, but with those same green eyes that had looked at me like he knew every secret I'd ever kept. Thomas Reed, Cortez began, was involved in one of the largest armored car robberies in Colorado history back in 2002. A heist that netted nearly $4 million and left 2 guards critically injured, one of whom never fully recovered and spent the rest of his short life in a wheelchair before dying of complications 5 years later. He paused to let that sink in, watching my face for reactions I wasn't sure I was having because my brain felt like it was wrapped in cotton, unable to process what a 20-year-old robbery had to do with me standing over a dying man's bed tonight. "The money was never recovered," Cortez continued, sliding another photograph toward me, this one showing a crime scene with an overturned armored truck and shattered glass sparkling on asphalt like deadly diamonds. And Thomas Reed disappeared before we could bring him in for questioning, vanishing so completely that some people thought he was dead, buried somewhere in the mountains, with his share of the money. But the FBI never closed the case because men like Reed don't just disappear. They hide, they wait, they watch. I finally found my voice, and it came out smaller than I wanted it to, barely more than a whisper that sounded like it belonged to someone else. "I don't understand what this has to do with me, Detective. I've never seen that man before tonight. I don't know anything about any robbery. I was barely 12 years old in 2002. Cortez's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy or might have been suspicion. It was impossible to tell. "That's the interesting part, Jessica," he said, and the way he used my first name felt too familiar, too intimate, like he knew things about me that I didn't know about myself. Because, according to our records, Thomas Reed had a daughter who went missing in 2001, a little girl named Emma Reed, who was 7 years old when she vanished from a park in Boulder, while her mother was distracted for less than 3 minutes, just long enough for someone to take her and disappear into a crowd of families enjoying a sunny Saturday afternoon. He slid another photograph across the table, and this one made my hands start shaking so badly that I had to grip the edge of the table to keep them still, because the little girl in the picture had dark hair and green eyes and a small birthmark on her left cheek in exactly the same place where I had a birthmark that I'd always been self-conscious about, the one I sometimes covered with makeup when I wanted to look perfect for special occasions. "That's not possible," I said, but my voice had no conviction in it because I was staring at that photograph and seeing my own childhood face, looking back at me, or at least a face that could have been mine if I squinted and let my imagination run wild with possibilities I didn't want to consider. I was adopted in 2003 by Martha and Donald Richardson. They found me through a legal adoption agency in Wyoming. There's paperwork, there are records. I have a birth certificate that says I was born in Cheyenne to a teenage mother who gave me up because she couldn't take care of me. Cortez nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting exactly this response, like he'd had this conversation before with other people whose lives had been built on foundations that turned out to be made of sand. We'll need to see all that paperwork, Jessica, because right now we have a situation where a wanted fugitive used his dying breath to call you his daughter and somehow knew you'd be at this hospital at this exact time, which suggests either an incredible coincidence or something much more deliberate and planned. The room felt like it was getting smaller, the walls pressing in on me from all sides while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, and I thought about Mark waiting for me at home, probably asleep in our bed with one arm stretched out to my side like he always did when I worked nights. And I thought about Evan tucked into his room surrounded by his dinosaur posters and plastic models, dreaming whatever dreams 10-year-old boys dream about, adventure and discovery, completely unaware that his mother was sitting in a hospital consultation room, having her entire identity questioned by a detective who looked at her like she might be a criminal or a victim, and he couldn't quite decide which. "I need to call my husband," I said, reaching for my phone in my pocket, but Cortez held up a hand to stop me, and that's when I knew this was worse than I thought, worse than anything I could have imagined in my darkest moments of anxiety. "Before you do that, Jessica, I need to ask you some questions about Mark Miller, your husband," he said, and something in his tone made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "How much do you know about his business dealings, about where he goes on his frequent trips out of state, about the people he meets with in those expensive restaurants downtown where he always pays in cash?" I felt like I'd been slapped, the sting of it spreading across my face and down my neck until my whole body felt hot and cold at the same time. "What are you implying about my husband?" I asked. But even as the words left my mouth, I was remembering things I'd pushed aside over the years, little inconsistencies that I'd explained away because it was easier than asking difficult questions, like the time I found $10,000 in cash hidden in his gym bag and he'd laughed it off saying a real estate deal had gone through and the client preferred cash, or the nights he came home late smelling like cigarette smoke, even though he claimed he didn't smoke, or the phone calls he took in. Another room with the door closed, speaking in low voices I couldn't quite make out, even when I pressed my ear against the wood, like a jealous wife in a bad movie. Cortez pulled out another set of photographs, these ones more recent, showing Mark sitting at a restaurant table with men I didn't recognize. Men in expensive suits with the kind of faces that appeared in news articles about organized crime and federal investigations. "Your husband has been photographed meeting with known associates of Thomas Reed on at least 6 occasions over the past 2 years, Cortez said, laying the photos out one by one, like he was building a case right there on the table between us. "We've had him under surveillance as part of a larger investigation into money laundering operations in the Denver area, and while we don't have enough evidence yet to bring charges, we have reason to believe that Mark Miller knows exactly who Thomas Reed is and may have been helping him hide for years, possibly in exchange for a portion of that missing $4 million. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing harder than the last until I felt bruised and broken inside, and I wanted to scream that they were wrong, that Mark was a good man, a good father, that he loved me and Evan and would never put us in danger. But the words wouldn't come because doubt had already started creeping in, like poison through my bloodstream, making me question every moment of the last 10 years of my marriage. "I think I'm going to be sick," I whispered, and Cortez quickly pushed a trash can toward me, but I managed to swallow down the bile rising in my throat, forcing myself to breathe slowly through my nose until the nausea passed and left me feeling hollow and scraped out inside. "I know this is a lot to process, Jessica," Cortez said, and for the first time his voice held something like genuine compassion, though it was buried under layers of professional detachment that came from years of delivering terrible news to unsuspecting people. But I need you to understand the gravity of the situation because right now you're at the center of an investigation that involves kidnapping, robbery, possibly murder, and we need to know what you know, when you knew it, and whether you've been complicit in any way. That last word snapped something inside me, broke through the fog of shock and disbelief, and I felt anger rising up to replace the confusion, hot and sharp and clarifying. Complicit, I repeated, my voice gaining strength as I leaned forward in my chair and met Cortez's eyes with all the fury I could muster. I work 12-hour shifts saving people's lives. I pack my son's lunch every morning and help him with his homework every night. I volunteer at his school and donate blood and do everything right, everything good, and you're sitting here suggesting that I somehow knew my entire life was a lie, that I was kidnapped as a child, that my husband is a criminal, and that I've just been going along with it all like some kind of willing participant in my own destruction? Cortez didn't flinch under my glare, didn't apologize or back down. He just watched me with those penetrating eyes that had probably seen every human emotion played out across countless faces in countless interrogation rooms. "I'm not suggesting anything, Jessica," he said calmly. "I'm investigating facts and following evidence wherever it leads, and right now it's leading me to you, whether you like it or not, whether you knew about any of this or not. And the only way we're going to untangle this mess is if you cooperate fully and answer every question I ask, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you." I slumped back in my chair, the fight draining out of me as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me feeling exhausted and defeated and scared in a way I hadn't been scared since I was a child, waking up from nightmares I could never quite remember in the morning. "What do you want to know?" I asked, and my voice sounded dead even to my own ears, flat and emotionless, like I was reading from a script I hadn't rehearsed. Cortez's expression softened slightly, but not enough to make me feel better, just enough to let me know he was about to make things worse. "I'm sure they believed they were doing the right thing," he said carefully, choosing his words like he was walking through a minefield. "And it's possible they had no idea the adoption wasn't entirely legal, that they were told everything was legitimate and they trusted the wrong people. But the fact remains that the documents we have on file for your adoption have red flags all over them." He slid a photocopy of my birth certificate across the table, and I stared at it like I was seeing it for the first time, even though I'd looked at it hundreds of times over the years, whenever I needed it for school registration or my nursing license or my marriage certificate. "See this seal here?" Cortez pointed to a stamp in the corner that I'd never paid much attention to before. "This particular seal was used by the agency only between January and March of 2003, but your adoption was supposedly finalized in August of that year, according to the date written here, which means someone backdated this document or forged it entirely." My hands were shaking again as I pulled the paper closer, studying every detail like I could somehow will it to make sense, to align with the life I thought I'd lived. "My parents died 4 years ago in a car accident," I said quietly, thinking about their funeral where I'd stood between Mark and 6-year-old Evan, holding my son's small hand while the pastor talked about God's mysterious plans, and I'd felt nothing but rage at a universe that would take away the only parents I'd ever known. I can't ask them about this now. I can't demand answers from people who are buried in Riverside Cemetery. So what exactly do you expect me to do with this information? Cortez leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and for a moment I thought I saw actual sympathy in his eyes. Not the professional kind, but the real human kind that recognized pain when it saw it. "I expect you to help me find the truth, Jessica. Because somewhere in your past, whether you remember it or not, there's a connection to Thomas Reed that goes beyond coincidence, and that connection might be the key to solving not just his case, but potentially dozens of other cases involving missing children and illegal adoptions that destroyed families and ruined lives. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, and I found myself thinking about Emma Reed, that little girl in the photograph with my face and my birthmark and my eyes, wondering what her life had been like before she disappeared, whether she'd been happy, whether she'd been loved, whether somewhere deep in my subconscious there were memories of a different mother, a different home, a different name. I don't remember anything before I was 7, I admitted, the words coming out slowly like I was pulling them from somewhere dark and buried inside myself. Martha and Donald used to tell me that was normal, that trauma could cause memory loss, and they said I'd been found wandering alone near a rest stop in Wyoming, that social services had tried to find my family but couldn't, that I'd been so quiet and withdrawn for the first few months that they worried I'd never speak again. Cortez was writing everything down in his notebook, his pen moving quickly across the page, and I wondered what he was thinking, whether he believed me or whether he thought I was another skilled liar in a world full of people who bent the truth to fit their needs. "Do you have any memories at all from before that time?" he asked, looking up from his notes. "Dreams, flashbacks, anything that might give us a clue about where you came from or what happened to you?" I closed my eyes and tried to reach back into that darkness, searching for something, anything that might prove I was more than just Jessica Miller, devoted wife and mother and nurse, who'd never questioned her own history because it had seemed complete enough, safe enough, real enough. "There's a song," I said slowly, surprising myself because I hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't let myself think about it because it brought up feelings I couldn't name or understand. "Sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I hear this melody, a woman's voice singing something soft and sad, and I can almost remember the words, but they slip away before I can catch them, and when I wake up, my face is wet with tears, even though I don't remember crying." Cortez stopped writing and looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, like he was trying to see through my skull into my brain where all my secrets were stored. "Can you hum it?" he asked, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of the request, humming a half-remembered lullaby in a hospital consultation room while a dying man's blood dried on my hands and my entire world crumbled around me. But I did it anyway, closing my eyes and letting the melody come, soft and haunting, a tune that had no name and no words, but felt ancient and important, like it carried the weight of everything I'd lost without knowing I'd lost it. When I finished, Cortez was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between shock and recognition and a kind of grim satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "That's a folk song from the Boulder area," he said quietly, pulling out his phone and scrolling through something before turning the screen toward me. "It's called Mountain Daughter, and it was written by a local musician in the 1990s, became popular with young mothers in that community." He paused, letting the implications sink in like stones dropping into deep water. "Thomas Reed and his wife lived in Boulder when Emma was born." The room tilted sideways and I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling, even though I was sitting down, even though gravity should have been holding me steady, but nothing felt steady anymore. Everything was shifting and breaking apart like ice cracking under too much weight. "This doesn't prove anything," I said desperately, hearing the panic in my own voice and hating it, hating how weak I sounded, how scared. Lots of people know that song. It could be a coincidence. It could be something I heard on the radio or at a store or anywhere. You can't just decide I'm Emma Reed because I can hum a tune that thousands of people probably know. Cortez put his phone away and closed his notebook, and somehow that felt worse than when he'd been writing everything down, like he'd already made up his mind about me, and nothing I said would change it. "You're right," he agreed, but his tone suggested he didn't really mean it, which is why we're going to need a DNA test, something that will definitively tell us whether you're Emma Reed or just a woman who happens to look remarkably like a missing child and somehow ended up married to a man with connections to that child's father. The word DNA hit me like a physical blow because it meant this was real. This wasn't going to go away. I couldn't just explain it away or pretend it hadn't happened. There would be scientific proof one way or another that would either confirm my worst fears or clear my name. And I didn't know which outcome terrified me more. Before I could respond to Cortez's request for DNA testing, his phone buzzed on the table between us, and he glanced at the screen with an expression that made every muscle in my body tense up because I'd learned to read people's faces during my years as a nurse, learned to see bad news coming before they said the words out loud. "Thomas Reed just died," Cortez said flatly, standing up from his chair and tucking his notebook into his jacket pocket. "We need to secure his personal effects, and I need you to stay here while I coordinate with my team. Don't call anyone. Don't leave this room. Don't do anything until I get back. Do you understand?" I nodded numbly, watching him leave and close the door behind him, and suddenly I was alone in that small consultation room with nothing but my racing thoughts and the sound of my own breathing that seemed too loud in the silence. Thomas Reed was dead. The man who'd called me his daughter with his last breath was gone, and with him went any chance of hearing his side of the story, of knowing why he'd said what he said, of understanding what connection he thought he had to me. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, even though Cortez had told me not to call anyone. But I needed to hear Mark's voice, needed some anchor to the life I'd built, even if that life was built on lies and secrets I hadn't known existed. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep and confusion. "Jess? What's wrong? It's almost 3 in the morning. Are you okay?" Just hearing him say my name made tears spring to my eyes because I wanted so badly to believe that he was innocent, that he loved me, that everything Cortez had shown me about Mark meeting with criminals was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. "Mark, I need you to tell me the truth about something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though I felt like I was falling apart from the inside out. "Do you know a man named Thomas Reed?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long that I thought the call had dropped. But then I heard him breathing, heard the rustle of sheets as he sat up in bed, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, had lost that sleepy warmth and become something careful and guarded. "Why are you asking me about Thomas Reed?" he said, and the fact that he didn't immediately deny knowing the name told me everything I needed to know, confirmed every terrible suspicion that Cortez had planted in my mind. "Because he died in my ICU tonight, and his last words were calling me his daughter. And now the FBI is here asking me questions about illegal adoptions and missing children, and showing me photographs of you meeting with his associates. So I need you to tell me right now what the hell is going on, Mark. I need you to tell me whether our entire marriage has been a lie." I heard him curse softly under his breath, and then there was movement, footsteps, a door closing, and I realized he'd gotten out of bed and gone somewhere private, probably to our home office where he took his mysterious phone calls, and that realization made something inside me harden and break at the same time. "Listen to me very carefully, Jessica," Mark said, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, low and urgent and edged with something that might have been fear or might have been anger. I couldn't tell which. "Don't answer any more questions without a lawyer present, don't sign anything, don't agree to any tests. Just tell them you want to speak with an attorney and then refuse to say anything else until I can get there with legal representation." His words sent ice through my veins because innocent people didn't immediately lawyer up. Innocent people didn't panic and give instructions about refusing to cooperate. Innocent people answered questions and helped investigations and trusted that the truth would set them free. "Oh my God," I whispered, feeling the last pieces of my denial crumbling away like sandcastles hit by waves. "It's all true, isn't it? You know who Thomas Reed is. You know why he called me his daughter. You've been lying to me for years about who you really are and what you really do and who I really am." Mark was talking fast now, words tumbling over each other in his rush to explain or justify or cover up. I couldn't tell which. It's not what you think, Jess. I was trying to protect you. I was trying to protect Evan. There are things about your past that you don't understand, things that would put you in danger if you knew them. So please just trust me one more time and do what I'm telling you. Don't talk to the police. Wait for me to get there with help. But I was done trusting him, done believing his explanations, done living in a world where everyone else seemed to know more about my own life than I did. Is Evan safe? I demanded, cutting through his rambling with the only question that really mattered, the only thing I cared about more than uncovering the truth about my own past. Is our son in any danger right now? Another pause, shorter this time, but somehow more ominous. And when Mark spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I've already called your sister to go stay at the house until we figure this out. She's on her way there now. Evan will be protected. I promise you that whatever else happens, our son will be safe. My sister Karen lived 20 minutes away and had a spare key to our house. She'd helped with Evan countless times over the years when Mark and I both had to work, and knowing she was going to be there with him made some of the panic recede enough for me to think clearly again. I have to go, I said, hearing footsteps in the hallway outside the consultation room. The detective is coming back, and I need to decide what I'm going to do, whether I'm going to keep protecting lies or start demanding truth. Mark was still talking when I ended the call, still trying to convince me to stay silent, but I silenced my phone and slipped it back into my pocket, just as Cortez opened the door and stepped inside with two other people following behind him, a woman in an FBI jacket and a man carrying what looked like evidence collection equipment. The woman introduced herself as Special Agent Monica Reeves, and she had the kind of sharp professional demeanor that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries or small talk, getting straight to business as she sat down across from me while the evidence technician set up his kit on the corner of the table. Mrs. Miller, we're going to need to collect a DNA sample from you tonight, Agent Reeves said, her tone making it clear this wasn't really a request, even though she phrased it politely. We have a court order if necessary, but we're hoping you'll cooperate voluntarily because the sooner we can establish your genetic relationship to Thomas Reed, the sooner we can start piecing together what happened 23 years ago when Emma Reed disappeared. I thought about Mark's warnings, about lawyers and refusing to cooperate, but I also thought about that little girl in the photograph with my face and my birthmark, and I realized that I needed to know the truth more than I needed to protect whatever secrets my husband had been keeping. I'll give you the DNA sample, I said, and Agent Reeves nodded to the technician who came forward with a swab and a consent form. But I want something in return. I want to see everything you have on Emma Reed, every report, every photograph, every piece of evidence that might help me understand who I really am. Cortez and Reeves exchanged a glance that seemed to communicate something without words, and then Reeves pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through files while the technician swabbed the inside of my cheek with practiced efficiency. Emma Reed was 7 years old when she vanished from Settlers Park in Boulder on June 15, 2001, Reeves began, turning the tablet so I could see crime scene photos of a sunny park with families and children playing, the kind of place that should have been safe but became the setting for every parent's worst nightmare. Her mother, Catherine Reed, had taken her there for a play date with friends, and according to witness statements, Catherine turned away for approximately 2 to 3 minutes to help another child who had fallen off the swings. Reeves swiped to the next image, a close-up of a playground area with yellow evidence markers scattered around. When Catherine turned back, Emma was gone, vanished without a scream or a struggle, or any indication of where she'd been taken, or who had taken her, and despite an extensive search involving hundreds of volunteers and multiple law enforcement agencies, no trace of her was ever found. I stared at the photos, trying to imagine myself as that little girl, trying to remember being in that park or feeling scared or calling out for a mother I couldn't recall. But there was nothing. Just the same dark emptiness that had always existed before my earliest memories of being with Martha and Donald Richardson. "What about Thomas Reed?" I asked, looking up from the tablet. Where was he when his daughter disappeared? Cortez took over the explanation, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. Thomas was supposed to be at work that day. He had an alibi for the time of the abduction, but he and Catherine had been having marital problems for months, fighting about money and his association with some questionable business partners, and after Emma vanished, their relationship fell apart completely. He paused, letting me absorb this information before continuing. Catherine blamed Thomas, said his criminal connections had put their daughter in danger, that someone had taken Emma to punish him or leverage him for something, but we could never prove any connection between the child's disappearance and Reed's activities, so the case went cold and stayed cold for over 2 decades. Agent Reeves swiped to another image, this one showing a woman with dark hair and devastated eyes, holding Emma's pink stuffed rabbit and staring at the camera like she was looking through it into some void of grief that had swallowed her whole. Catherine Reed committed suicide in 2007, Reeves said quietly. Left a note saying she couldn't live with not knowing what happened to her daughter, couldn't keep wondering if Emma was alive somewhere calling for her mother, couldn't bear the thought that her baby might have suffered because Catherine had looked away for just a few seconds. The photograph blurred as tears filled my eyes because even if I wasn't Emma Reed, even if this all turned out to be some cosmic coincidence, that woman had lost her child and then lost her will to live, and somewhere in the universe that kind of pain deserved to be acknowledged. What happened to Thomas after his wife died? I asked, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand. Why was he on the FBI's wanted list? Cortez pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, like the weight of the case was something physical he'd been carrying for years. 3 months after Catherine's suicide, Thomas Reed and 3 other men robbed an armored car outside a bank in Commerce City, got away with nearly $4 million in a heist that was so well planned it looked professional, military-grade coordination and equipment. He pulled out his phone and showed me footage from security cameras, grainy black and white images of masked men moving with precision and purpose. 2 guards were injured in the robbery, one seriously enough that he never fully recovered, and while we identified the other 3 perpetrators and arrested them within weeks, Thomas Reed disappeared with his share of the money and we never found him, until tonight when he showed up dying in your ICU and calling you his daughter with his last breath. The technician finished collecting my DNA sample and sealed it in an evidence bag, labeling it with date and timestamps while I sat there trying to process everything I'd just learned, trying to fit these puzzle pieces into a picture that made sense but kept coming up with images that terrified me. "How long until you get the DNA results?" I asked, watching the technician pack up his equipment with the careful movements of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Agent Reeves checked her watch and then looked at Cortez before answering. "We flagged this as priority, so we should have preliminary results within 48 hours, possibly sooner if we can expedite the lab work. But in the meantime, we need to discuss your husband's involvement in this situation." The way she said it made my stomach clench because I'd been hoping they might have forgotten about Mark's connection to Reed's associates, might have let that slide while we focused on the bigger question of my identity, but clearly the FBI didn't forget anything or let anything slide. "Mark called me a few minutes ago," I admitted, deciding that honesty was my only option now that I'd already given them my DNA, already committed to finding the truth no matter how much it hurt. "He told me not to talk to you without a lawyer, told me to refuse cooperation, which pretty much confirms that he knows something he shouldn't know about all of this." Cortez's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, satisfaction maybe, or vindication that his suspicions about Mark had been correct. "What else did he say?" Cortez asked, pulling out his notebook again. I told them everything. About Mark's panic when I mentioned Thomas Reed's name, about his insistence that he'd been trying to protect me, about him calling my sister to stay with Evan, and with each detail I shared, I felt like I was betraying my husband, but also like I was finally breaking free from whatever web of deception he'd trapped me in. "We've had surveillance on your husband for 6 months," Reeves said, opening a different file on her tablet and showing me more photographs of Mark, dozens of them taken from various angles showing him meeting with different men in different locations, always looking over his shoulder, always checking his surroundings like he knew he might be watched. "We believe he's been laundering money for a criminal organization that has ties to Thomas Reed's original robbery crew, moving cash through real estate transactions that look legitimate on paper but involve properties that are bought and sold at inflated prices to hide the source of the funds." The photographs kept coming, each one a small knife cutting away at the life I thought I'd had, showing me a man I didn't recognize even though he had my husband's face and wore my husband's clothes. "We have reason to believe," Reeves continued, "that Mark Miller knew exactly who you were when he met you, that your relationship wasn't a coincidence, but part of a larger plan to keep Thomas Reed's daughter close, to monitor you, possibly to use you as leverage if Reed ever resurfaced and threatened to expose the people he'd worked with." Her words hit me like a wrecking ball, destroying the last walls of my denial, and suddenly I was standing up, knocking my chair backward, feeling the room spin around me while my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. "You're telling me my marriage was fake?" I said, hearing my voice rise to a pitch that sounded hysterical even to my own ears. "You're saying Mark has been lying to me for 10 years, that he married me and gave me a child and built a home with me, all because of some criminal conspiracy involving money and murders and missing children?" Cortez stood up too, holding out his hands in a calming gesture, but staying back, giving me space to process this avalanche of information that kept burying me deeper. "We don't know for certain what Mark knew or when he knew it," Cortez said carefully. "It's possible he started out following orders, but actually fell in love with you over time. It's possible he's been trying to protect you in his own misguided way, but the facts suggest that your relationship began under false pretenses, and that Mark has been involved with dangerous people who have every reason to want Thomas Reed's daughter under their control." I thought about Evan sleeping peacefully at home, innocent and unaware that his entire family was built on lies and crimes, and I felt a rage building inside me that was stronger than the fear, stronger than the confusion, a mother's fury at anyone who would use a child as a pawn in their games. "I need to see my son," I said firmly, making it clear this wasn't negotiable. "I need to make sure he's safe, and I need to be there when he wakes up tomorrow morning because whatever else is happening, whatever else I find out about my past or my husband's crimes, Evan is innocent in all of this, and I will not let him become collateral damage in your investigation." Agent Reeves and Cortez looked at each other again with that silent communication that law enforcement partners develop over years of working together, and then Reeves nodded slowly. "We can arrange for you to go home under escort," she said, "but you need to understand that your house may be under surveillance, that Mark may try to contact you or come there himself, and if he does, we need you to cooperate with us, to help us bring him in peacefully, so we can sort out his involvement and hopefully prevent anyone else from getting hurt." I agreed because I didn't have a choice, because my son's safety was worth more than my pride or my marriage or my need to believe that some part of my life had been real and honest and good. They led me out of the consultation room and through the hospital corridors, where my co-workers stared at me with curiosity and concern, probably wondering why Jessica Miller was walking out with FBI agents at 4 a.m, probably already starting the gossip that would spread through the hospital like wildfire by the time the day shift arrived. The ride to my house took 20 minutes through empty Denver streets, me in the back of an unmarked car with Agent Reeves, while Cortez followed in another vehicle, both of them talking on their phones to other agents and coordinators, setting up surveillance and planning whatever operation they had in mind for bringing Mark in. When we pulled up to my house, I saw Karen's car in the driveway and felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy, because at least Evan had someone there with him, someone who loved him and would protect him even if she didn't understand why protection was necessary. I used my key to open the front door quietly, not wanting to wake Evan if he was still sleeping, and found Karen sitting on the couch in the living room with all the lights on, her phone clutched in one hand and her face pale with worry. "Jess, what's going on?" she whispered urgently, standing up when she saw me followed by Agent Reeves. Mark called me at 2 a.m. saying there was an emergency and I needed to come stay with Evan, but he wouldn't tell me what kind of emergency, and when I tried to call you, your phone went straight to voicemail. I hugged my sister because I needed to hold on to something real and solid, needed to feel connected to someone who wasn't part of this nightmare. And then I told her as much as I could without breaking down completely. "Everything's going to be okay," I said, not sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "Just stay here with Evan and don't let anyone in except me or the police. And if Mark shows up, call 911 immediately. Do you understand?" Karen's eyes went wide with fear and confusion, but she nodded, gripping my hands tightly. "Is Evan in danger?" she asked, and I could hear the terror in her voice because she loved my son almost as much as I did, had been there when he was born, had watched him grow from a tiny baby into the smart, funny kid who filled our lives with dinosaur facts and terrible jokes. "I don't think so," I said honestly, "but I'm not taking any chances, so please just do what I'm asking and keep him safe while I figure out how to fix this mess." I went upstairs to Evan's room and stood in the doorway watching him sleep, his face peaceful and innocent in the glow of his dinosaur nightlight, surrounded by posters of T-Rexes and Triceratops that he'd carefully arranged on every wall. And I felt my heart break into 1,000 pieces, because how was I supposed to explain to a 10-year-old child that his father might be a criminal, that his mother might not be who she thought she was, that the family he'd always trusted and relied on was built on secrets that were finally coming to light in the worst possible way? I wanted to wake him up and hold him and promise that everything would be okay, but I couldn't make promises I didn't know if I could keep. So instead, I just watched him breathe in and out, memorizing every detail of his face in case somehow this all went wrong and I lost him, lost everything, ended up being someone else entirely who didn't deserve this perfect child who trusted me completely. Agent Reeves appeared behind me in the hallway, her voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Miller, we need you to come back downstairs. We've received some new information that you need to hear." I kissed my fingertips and pressed them to Evan's doorframe like a blessing or a prayer, then followed Reeves back down to the living room where Cortez had set up a laptop on my coffee table, the screen showing what looked like security footage from various locations. "We've been tracking Mark's movements since you called him from the hospital," Cortez said, turning the laptop so I could see better. "He left your house approximately 10 minutes after that call, drove to a storage facility in Aurora, and retrieved something from a unit registered under a false name. Then he met with 2 men at a diner off I-70, where they appeared to have an intense conversation that lasted about 20 minutes. The footage showed Mark looking stressed and angry, gesturing with his hands, while the 2 men across from him remained calm and controlled. And I recognized one of them from the photographs Cortez had shown me earlier, one of Thomas Reed's known associates. After that meeting," Cortez continued, "Mark drove to a bank in Lakewood and accessed a safe deposit box, again using a false identity, and we believe he's now liquidating assets and preparing to either run or make some kind of move that requires significant cash resources." I sank onto the couch next to Karen, who put her arm around me, and I leaned into my sister's warmth while trying to process the fact that my husband of 10 years was currently doing exactly what guilty criminals do when they know the walls are closing in. "Where is he now?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "We don't know," Agent Reeves admitted, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "He's not at any of his known locations. His phone is off, and his car was found abandoned in a parking garage downtown, which suggests he's switched vehicles and is actively trying to evade surveillance." The implications of that hung in the air like poison gas, spreading through my lungs until I could barely breathe. Because if Mark was running, then he was guilty of something, probably many things, And that meant Evan and I were connected to crimes we knew nothing about, would be questioned and investigated, and possibly destroyed by association. "There's something else," Cortez said, and his tone made me look up from where I'd been staring at my hands, made me focus on his face, which had taken on an expression I couldn't quite read. "We expedited your DNA test, pulled some strings at the lab, and got preliminary results back faster than we expected. And Jessica, the results show a 99.9% probability that you are biologically related to Thomas Reed, that you are almost certainly his daughter, Emma." The words seemed to come from very far away, like Cortez was speaking to me from the other end of a long tunnel, and I felt Karen's arm tighten around me as everything I'd been holding together finally shattered and fell apart, leaving me sitting in the wreckage of my identity, wondering who I was supposed to be now that Jessica Miller had been revealed as a fiction, a carefully constructed lie that I'd been living without knowing it. "So it's true," I whispered, my voice breaking on the words. "I was kidnapped as a child. My whole life has been based on a crime. Everything I thought I knew about myself is wrong." Agent Reeves sat down on my other side, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "We don't have all the answers yet about exactly what happened or who was involved in your abduction. But what we do know is that you were a victim, Jessica. You were a child who was taken from her family through no fault of your own, and nothing that happened to you back then changes who you've become, the life you've built, the good you've done in the world." But it did change things. It changed everything. Because how could I trust any of my memories or feelings or relationships when the foundation they were built on turned out to be lies, when even my own name might not really belong to me? "What happens now?" Karen asked, speaking up for the first time since the agents had started explaining. "What does this mean for Jessica and Evan? Are they in danger? Do they need protection?" Cortez closed his laptop and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "We believe Mark knows or suspects that Jessica's true identity has been discovered, and that's why he's running. Because if she really is Emma Reed, then there are people who paid a lot of money years ago to make sure she disappeared and stayed disappeared, and those people won't want her alive and talking about what she might remember or figure out." The casual way he said, "won't want her alive," made my blood run cold, made me pull Karen closer like we could protect each other through physical proximity alone. "You think someone will try to kill me?" I asked, needing to hear it stated plainly rather than implied through careful law enforcement language. "I think you're a loose end that certain dangerous people would prefer to tie up permanently," Cortez said bluntly, "which is why we're going to station agents outside your house 24/7, why we're going to have plainclothes officers at Evan's school, and why you're going to need to be very careful about where you go and who you talk to until we can round up everyone involved in this conspiracy and put them somewhere they can't hurt you." The next 2 days passed in a blur of fear and confusion and constant vigilance, with FBI agents camped in my living room and patrol cars circling my neighborhood, while I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Evan, who kept asking why there were so many police around and why he couldn't go to his friend's house after school like usual. I told him there had been some threats at the hospital where I worked, that the police were just being extra careful to keep us safe, and he seemed to accept this explanation the way children accept most things their parents tell them, with trust that felt both precious and terrifying, given everything I now knew about how easily that trust could be betrayed. Karen stayed with us the whole time, sleeping in, the guest room and helping with meals and homework and all the normal routines that felt absurd to maintain when my entire world had been turned inside out. But I was grateful for her presence, for her steady calm in the face of chaos, for the way she didn't ask too many questions about details I wasn't ready to share. On the third morning, I woke up to find Cortez in my kitchen drinking coffee and looking like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes red-rimmed and his face drawn with exhaustion that came from chasing shadows and dead ends. "We found Mark," he said without preamble, and something in his tone made my chest tighten with dread. "He's in the morgue, Jessica. He was found shot to death in a motel room in Colorado Springs yesterday evening, and based on the evidence at the scene, it looks like an execution. Professional and clean. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing." I stood there in my pajamas holding a coffee mug that suddenly felt too heavy for my hands, trying to process the information that my husband was dead, that Evan's father had been murdered, that despite all the lies and crimes and betrayals, Mark was still the man I'd loved for 10 years, the man who'd held my hand during labor, who'd taught our son to ride a bike, who'd kiss me goodbye every morning like he actually meant it. "Who killed him?" I finally managed to ask, setting down the mug before I dropped it. "We're working on that," Cortez said, "but we believe it was ordered by the same people who orchestrated your abduction 23 years ago, people who are now eliminating anyone who knows the truth about what happened to Emma Reed." He paused, letting me absorb this before delivering the final blow. "We think you're next on their list, Jessica, which means we need to move you and Evan into protective custody immediately, get you somewhere safe while we work to identify and arrest everyone involved in this organization." Everything after that happened very fast. Agents packing bags for me and Evan, Karen crying and hugging us both, my son confused and scared as we were rushed into unmarked cars and driven to a safe house location. They wouldn't tell me in advance, and through it all, I kept thinking about Thomas Reed's last word, daughter, and wondering if he'd known he was putting me in danger by acknowledging me, if his dying confession had set off a chain reaction that was now consuming everything I'd ever loved. At the safe house, which turned out to be a nondescript apartment in a building full of federal witnesses and protected persons, Agent Reeves finally sat me down and showed me the rest of the file on Emma Reed's disappearance, including details they'd kept from me during those first chaotic days. "Your abduction was never random," Reeves explained, spreading documents across the kitchen table while Evan watched DTV in the other room under the supervision of a female agent who'd brought coloring books and snacks. "Thomas Reed had stolen money from his criminal partners months before you were taken, money they needed to launder through various operations, and when they couldn't find the money or force Thomas to return it, they took you as collateral, as insurance that he'd eventually cooperate." She showed me transcripts of intercepted phone calls, evidence of negotiations between Reed and the people who'd taken his daughter, demands and counter-demands that stretched over weeks and months, while a 7-year-old girl remained missing and her mother spiraled into despair. "But something went wrong with the exchange," Reeves continued, "and instead of returning you to your parents, the kidnappers sold you to a network that specialized in providing children to couples willing to pay for illegal adoptions. Couples who didn't ask too many questions about where the children came from as long as the paperwork looked legitimate enough to pass casual inspection." I thought about Martha and Donald Richardson, about whether they'd known or suspected that their adopted daughter had been stolen from another family, and I wanted to believe they'd been innocent victims too, had been lied to by adoption facilitators who specialized in making criminal enterprises look like legal procedures. "The money Thomas stole was never recovered," Reeves said, pulling out another document covered in financial transactions and coded entries, which means it's still out there somewhere, possibly hidden in accounts or properties under names we haven't identified yet, and the people who've been searching for it all these years believe you might know where it is, might have information Thomas passed to you before he died. I shook my head frantically, because I didn't know anything about any money, didn't have offshore accounts or safe deposit boxes or buried treasure maps. I was just a nurse who worked hard and paid her bills and tried to be a good mother. "I don't know where any money is," I insisted, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "Thomas Reed was a stranger to me until 3 days ago. He didn't tell me anything except one word before he died. So how would I possibly know where he hid millions of dollars 20 years ago?" Cortez entered the apartment carrying takeout food and looking like he'd finally gotten some sleep, and he set the bags on the counter before joining us at the table. "We don't think Thomas told you directly," he said, pulling up a chair, "but we think the information might be hidden in your adoption records, in the false documents that were created to give you a new identity, because criminals often hide valuable information in plain sight by encoding it in seemingly legitimate paperwork that no one would think to look at twice." He showed me photocopies of my birth certificate and adoption papers, pointing to numbers and dates and reference codes that looked random but might contain patterns if you knew what you were looking for. "We have cryptography experts analyzing these documents," Cortez continued, "and we believe Thomas Reed embedded account numbers or coordinates or some kind of key to accessing the stolen money within the paperwork that created Jessica Miller's identity, ensuring that even if something happened to him, the information would survive in records that you would keep safe without realizing what you were protecting. The idea was so absurd and yet so perfectly criminal that I almost laughed. Except nothing about this situation was funny. Nothing about discovering I was worth more dead than alive because of information I didn't know I had. Information that had been tattooed into my identity like invisible ink, waiting for the right light to reveal its secrets. That night, I lay in bed in the safe house, listening to Evan breathe in the other room and thinking about Catherine Reed, about the mother who'd lost me and never recovered, who'd blamed herself for looking away at the wrong moment when really she'd been a pawn in a game played by men who valued money more than children's lives. I thought about Mark too, about whether he'd ever really loved me or if I'd just been an assignment, a job he'd performed convincingly enough to fool us both, and I realized I'd never know the truth about his feelings because dead men don't explain their motivations or apologize for their deceptions. Somewhere out there, people were hunting me because of numbers and codes hidden in documents I'd carried my whole life without understanding their significance. And the only way to end this nightmare was to find the money first, to decode the secrets Thomas Reed had embedded in my identity and use them to bargain for my son's safety and my own survival. Tomorrow, Agent Reeves had promised to bring the cryptography team's findings to show me what they'd discovered in my birth certificate and adoption papers, and then we would decide together how to proceed, whether to use the information as bait to draw out the criminals or to simply recover the money and return it in exchange for being left alone. As I finally drifted toward sleep, I heard that melody again, the lullaby I'd been humming for years without knowing its name or meaning, and I realized it wasn't just a song my mother had sung to comfort me. It was also Thomas Reed's final message, a code embedded in music that only his daughter would remember, a key to unlocking secrets that could either destroy me or set me free, and I wouldn't know which until I followed the melody to whatever truth waited at its end, whatever final revelation would tell me once and for all who Jessica Miller really was, and whether Emma Reed could finally, after 23 years of being lost, find her way home.